Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me.
The wind howled around Arthur as he stood at the edge of the cliff, gazing at the distant horizon where the mountains met the sky. His heart raced, not from fear, but from the weight of the decision before him. For weeks, Merlin had been preparing him, guiding him through ancient texts and forgotten lore. The sky sword, a weapon of legend, lay hidden somewhere high above the clouds, and whoever wielded it would have the power to reshape kingdoms. "Are you sure?" Arthur asked, turning to face the old wizard. Merlin stood just behind him, his long silver hair whipping in the wind, eyes distant, as though already looking to the future. He wore his usual blue robes, tattered and worn from years of use but still radiating an aura of immense power. Merlin nodded. "Morgana has begun her search. If she reaches the sword first, Arthur, all will be lost." Arthur's stomach knotted at the mention of Morgana. Once, she had been a friend, an ally even. But power had corrupted her, twisted her into something unrecognizable. Now, she sought dominion over all who opposed her. The sky sword would give her exactly that. Arthur turned back to the cliff. "And you're sure I'm ready for this?" Merlin walked up beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "No one is ever truly ready, Arthur. But you are as close as one can be. Remember, the trials ahead will not just test your strength. They will test your heart, your soul." The words hung in the air between them, and Arthur exhaled slowly, knowing what was at stake. His mind wandered to Camelot, to the people he had sworn to protect. They believed in him, as did Merlin. But doubt still gnawed at him, whispering that he wasn't worthy, that he couldn't do it. "Let's begin," Arthur said finally, pulling himself together. The doubt wouldn't stop him. "Not now." Merlin gave a small, satisfied smile, and with a wave of his hand, conjured a glowing portal. Beyond it lay their path to the sky sword, a journey filled with danger, mystery, and trials that only the truly worthy could survive. Arthur stepped forward, feeling the familiar rush of magic tingling across his skin as they passed through the portal. The world shifted around them, colors blurring until they found themselves standing at the base of a massive mountain, its peak disappearing into a bank of clouds far above. The air was thinner here, colder, and a strange energy pulsed through the ground beneath their feet. Merlin began walking, staff in hand, and Arthur followed. The mountain loomed before them, an ancient presence, as if watching their every move. Arthur could feel a sense of purpose within the rock, as though it was more than just a mountain. This was the first test, he realized. As they ascended, the path grew steeper, the air colder. Time seemed to stretch, and Arthur lost track of how long they had been climbing. The trees thinned out, replaced by jagged rocks and sheer cliffs. At one point, Arthur glanced over the edge and felt his stomach lurch at the sight of a seemingly endless drop into the clouds below. "You must stay focused," Merlin said from ahead, his voice calm but firm. "The trials of this mountain are not just physical. It will try to unsettle you, to make you doubt." Arthur nodded, though his mouth was dry. His thoughts returned to Morgana, to the dark magic she wielded with such ease. If she reached the sword first, no, he couldn't let that happen. Hours passed, or perhaps days, it was impossible to tell in this strange, timeless place. But eventually, they reached a plateau. There, nestled among the rocks, stood a great stone gate, carved with intricate runes that glowed faintly in the twilight. "This is the first trial," Merlin said, his gaze fixed on the gate. "It is not one of strength, but of compassion." Arthur frowned. "Compassion? What do you mean?" Before Merlin could respond, a deep, rumbling growl echoed through the air. From behind the gate, a massive creature emerged. Its body was made of stone, its eyes glowing with an airy light. It towered over them, its limbs thick and powerful, each step causing the ground to tremble. Arthur instinctively reached for his sword, but Merlin held up a hand to stop him. "This is not a foe to be defeated with steel, Arthur. It is a creature of sorrow, bound to this place by pain and loss. You must understand it, feel its pain, and offer it peace." Arthur's hand hesitated on the hilt of his sword, but How? Listen to it, Merlin said softly. Sometimes, the greatest strength is not in fighting, but in listening. The stone creature stopped a few paces from them, its glowing eyes fixed on Arthur. He could feel its gaze, heavy with ancient sadness. Slowly, he released his grip on his sword and took a step forward. "I'm here to help," Arthur said, though his voice felt small in the presence of such a colossal being. I don't want to hurt you." The creature let out another low growl, but it didn't attack. Instead, it lowered its head, and Arthur saw, to his surprise, that its eyes were filled with tears of stone that rolled down its face and shattered upon the ground. Arthur's heart ached at the sight. This creature wasn't a monster. It was suffering. Without thinking, he stepped closer, reaching out a hand. He didn't know what he was doing, but something deep inside him told him this was right. "I'm sorry," Arthur whispered. "I'm sorry for whatever pain you've endured." The creature's growl softened, and it lowered its head further, until Arthur could touch its rough, stone skin. As his fingers brushed the creature's surface, a strange warmth spread through him. The sorrow, the pain it flowed into him, and for a moment, Arthur was overwhelmed by the sheer weight of it. He saw flashes of the creature's past, moments of joy long forgotten, followed by a crushing sense of loss. But then, as Arthur stood there, offering his silent empathy, the creature began to change. Its massive stone body shimmered, the rough edges softening. Slowly, it transformed before his eyes, becoming something more human, more peaceful. "Thank you," a voice rumbled from within the creature. "Thank you for understanding." And then, with a final, gentle sigh, the creature faded into the air, leaving only a faint trail of light in its wake. The gate ahead of them opened with a soft creak. Arthur stood there for a moment, still processing what had just happened. He had faced monsters before, but this was something entirely different. He hadn't fought the creature. He had healed it. "Well done," Merlin said, his voice filled with quiet pride. "You've passed the first trial." Arthur nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. If the first trial had tested his compassion, what would the others demand of him? They continued their ascent, the air growing colder and thinner with every step. Arthur's muscles ached from the climb, but he pressed on, driven by the knowledge that Morgana was still out there, seeking the sword for herself. As they reached the next plateau, a thick fog rolled in, obscuring the path ahead. Arthur could barely see a few feet in front of him, and a sense of unease settled over him. "This is the second trial," Merlin said, his voice barely audible over the wind. "The trial of illusions. It will test your mind, your perception of reality." Arthur swallowed hard. He had heard of trials like this before, where the lines between truth and illusion blurred, where even the strongest could be driven mad. Suddenly, the fog parted, revealing a figure standing just ahead, a familiar figure. "Arthur?" The voice was soft, gentle, and unmistakable. "Guinevere." Arthur's heart leapt into his throat. She stood before him, her long, golden hair blowing in the wind, her eyes filled with warmth and love. It had been so long since he had seen her, touched her. "I've missed you," she whispered, stepping closer. Arthur's mind raced. He wanted to believe it was her, wanted to reach out and pull her into his arms. But something wasn't right. This couldn't be real. She wasn't here. She couldn't be. "This is an illusion," Arthur said, his voice shaking. "You're not real." Guinevere's smile faltered, and for a moment, Arthur saw something dark flicker in her eyes. "Arthur, it's me. You know me. You love me." Arthur clenched his fists, his heart aching with the desire to believe her. But deep down, he knew this was a trick, a test. He couldn't give in. "I love you," Arthur whispered, his voice filled with pain. "But you're not real." And with those words, the illusion shattered. Guinevere's form dissolved into the fog, leaving only emptiness in her place. Arthur stood there, his chest tight, but he knew he had made the right choice. "Well done," Merlin said, stepping out of the fog. "The sword will not be claimed by those who seek power for selfish reasons. You have proven that your heart is true." Arthur nodded, though the pain of losing Guinevere illusion or notice still lingered. But he couldn't dwell on it now. The final trial awaited. Arthur stood silently for a moment, letting the remnants of the illusion fade from his mind. The ache in his chest from seeing Guinevere, even in false form, was still raw. He took a deep breath, trying to clear his thoughts. There was no time to linger in pain or doubt. The sky sword awaited, and Morgana was still out there, her intentions more dangerous than ever. Merlin, ever watchful, gave him a small nod, signaling it was time to move on. The mist around them seemed to lift slightly, revealing the path at a narrow, rocky trail winding up the mountainside. Without another word, Arthur began to walk. Each step felt heavier than the last, not just because of the physical toll but because of the emotional weight of the trials he had already endured. The air grew colder as they ascended, and soon, snow began to fall, light at first but quickly thickening into a blizzard. The wind howled, whipping around them, and Arthur found himself struggling to see more than a few feet ahead. He pulled his cloak tighter around him, but the cold bit deep into his bones. "This is it," Merlin said over the wind. "The final trial." Arthur glanced at him, noticing the solemn expression on the old wizard's face. "What do I need to do?" Merlin's eyes darkened. "This trial will test your soul, Arthur. Your will to succeed. The Sky Sword is near, but so is Morgana. She will do everything in her power to stop you from reaching it. You must be prepared for whatever comes." Arthur nodded, his jaw set in determination. He had come too far to turn back now. They pushed forward through the snow, their movements slow but steady. The blizzard was relentless, the wind almost deafening, but Arthur could sense they were close. Something was pulling him forward, a strange energy in the air that seemed to hum with power. And then, through the swirling snow, he saw a faint glow in the distance. The Sky Sword. It was embedded in the side of the mountain, high above them, glowing with an ethereal light that cut through the storm. Arthur's heart raced at the sight of it, but before he could take a step closer, a figure appeared in front of him, materializing out of the snow like a shadow. Morgana. She stood tall, her dark robes billowing in the wind, her eyes glowing with malevolent power. A cruel smile curled her lips as she looked at Arthur, her gaze filled with contempt. "You've come all this way for nothing," she said, her voice like ice. "The sword will never be yours." Arthur drew his sword, the steel gleaming despite the storm. "I won't let you have it, Morgana. This ends here." Morgana laughed, a cold, mocking sound that sent chills down Arthur's spine. "You think you can stop me? You're nothing, Arthur." A child playing at being a king. Her words stung, but Arthur held his ground. He had faced her before, had seen the darkness she wielded, and he knew the stakes. If she claimed the Sky Sword, the entire realm would fall under her control. Merlin stepped forward, his staff glowing faintly in the storm. "This is not your destiny, Morgana. The sword does not belong to you." Morgana's eyes flicked to Merlin, her smile fading. "You've always underestimated me, Merlin." "But no longer." With a flick of her hand, dark energy surged from her fingertips, aimed directly at the wizard. Merlin raised his staff, deflecting the blast, but the force of it sent him stumbling back. Arthur's eyes widened in panic as Merlin collapsed to one knee, struggling to rise. "Morgana!" Arthur shouted, stepping in front of Merlin to protect him. "You've always been a fool, Arthur," Morgana hissed, her eyes blazing. "This is my moment. My power is beyond anything you can imagine." Arthur didn't respond. He tightened his grip on his sword and charged. Morgana's magic lashed out, dark tendrils of energy snaking toward him, but Arthur moved with a speed and agility that surprised even himself. He dodged the attacks, closing the distance between them. He swung his sword, aiming for her chest, but Morgana vanished in a swirl of black smoke, reappearing several feet away with a sneer. "You can't win," she said, her voice filled with disdain. Arthur gritted his teeth, his body burning with adrenaline. He couldn't give up. Not now. Not when they were so close. Merlin struggled to his feet behind him, his face pale but determined. "Arthur, you must trust in yourself," He called out over the wind. "The sword will come to you if you prove your worth." Arthur's heart pounded as Morgana prepared another spell, her hands crackling with dark magic. He had to find a way to stop her, to end this before she reached the sword. But how? Then, in a flash of clarity, Arthur realized the truth. The sky sword wasn't just a weapon of power. It was a test of his heart, his soul, his ability to resist the temptation of absolute strength. Morgana had already failed that test, consumed by her lust for control. But Arthur, he knew what he had to do. With a deep breath, he sheathed his sword and stood tall, his hands at his sides. Morgana hesitated, her eyes narrowing in confusion. "What are you doing?" she demanded. Arthur took a step forward, his voice calm but firm. "I don't need the sword to defeat you, Morgana. It's not power that makes a king. It's the ability to know when not to use it." Morgana's face twisted in fury. "You think you can lecture me? You are nothing without power." Arthur shook his head. "You're wrong. Power isn't what defines us. It's how we choose to wield it or not to wield it at all." The air around them seemed to still, the blizzard calming as if the mountain itself was listening. Arthur could feel the sky sword watching, waiting. He could sense its approval, a warmth spreading through him despite the cold. Morgana let out a scream of rage, her hands igniting with dark magic. She hurled everything she had at Arthur, a torrent of black energy that would have destroyed anyone in its path. But Arthur stood firm, his heart steady, his resolve unshaken. As the magic rushed toward him, he raised his hand not in defense, but in peace. And in that moment, the magic faltered, weakening, and then dissipating entirely. Morgana staggered back, her eyes wide with disbelief. "No. No, this can't be." Arthur took another step forward, his gaze locked on hers. "It's over, Morgana. You've lost." Morgana's face twisted in desperation. She turned toward the sky sword, her hand outstretched, but the sword remained still, untouched. It did not respond to her. It did not acknowledge her. With a cry of frustration, Morgana collapsed to her knees, her strength drained, her power broken. Arthur stood over her, his heart heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. He had won, but it didn't feel like a victory. Morgana, once his friend, was now nothing more than a shadow of her former self, consumed by her own ambition. Merlin approached slowly, his face somber. "You did it," he said softly. Arthur nodded, but his gaze remained on Morgana. "What happens to her now?" Merlin sighed. "That is for the fates to decide. She made her choices, and now she must live with them." Arthur looked up at the sky sword, still glowing faintly in the mountain's side. He could feel its power calling to him, beckoning him to take it. But he knew better now. The sword wasn't meant for him. It wasn't meant for anyone. He turned away from it, leaving it where it was, embedded in the mountain, a symbol of power and restraint. As they began their descent, the snow finally stopped falling, and the sky above them cleared, revealing a brilliant sunset on the horizon. The journey was over, but Arthur's path as a leader was just beginning. He had proven himself, not by taking the sword, but by knowing when to walk away.